Since the turn of the millennium, the global economic center of gravity has steadily shifted towards Asia. With the money taps turned on, vast sums of foreign direct investment help to fuel a rising economic tide for China, India, and the countries that make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. In this video, we'll explore the economics of the ASEAN nations, often overshadowed by their gigantic northern neighbors, China and India. This motley crew of countries exists as a microcosm of the global economy. For the most unique, we have Brunei, the small but wealthy petrostate, the small island nation of Singapore, the financial and technological power center of ASEAN, and Indonesia, with its large population of 277 million people. It alone accounts for 40% of ASEAN's human capital. Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, emerging manufacturing powerhouses in their own right, total nearly 300 million inhabitants. Malaysia provides a highly diversified and competitive economy while boasting a purchasing power parity, gross national income per capita that is 1.5 times greater than China's. And finally, we have the countries of Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, the lowest on the developmental scale. After decades of conflict and war, we can hope that their futures may look brighter. However, after the Myanmar Civil War began in 2021, Myanmar has descended into conflict, an inviting playground of intrigue for global superpower players. Its geographic location, near sensitive areas of the Indian and Chinese border, may see the shadow over Myanmar continue to darken as global politics cleaves into multipolarity. For our analysis, we'll first examine the population size and the human developmental indicators for the ASEAN nations, along with India and China. We'll then move to an analysis of GDP, manufacturing value-added MVA, and foreign direct investment, FDI. We'll examine the individual countries that compose ASEAN, as well as comparing the ASEAN bloc with the big boys in the neighborhood, India and China. The total population of ASEAN is close to 700 million people, making it around half the size of India and China. The population distribution is very top-heavy, with Indonesia accounting for 40% of the population, while the Petro Kingdom of Brunei has only 500,000 inhabitants. The GDP per capita stats are just as top-heavy, with the super-wealthy Singapore having a GDP per capita of $85,000 in 2023, placing it somewhere in the global top 5. Awash in petrodollars, Brunei is also an outlier, while the rest of the group slowly tapers down until we reach Myanmar, the poorest of the bloc. If we examine life expectancy at birth and the Human Developmental Index, the HDI, we see a similar trend, again, as if a microcosm of the global economy. The ASEAN nations run the gamut from super wealth to extreme poverty. As a bloc, the ASEAN nations nearly surpass India in terms of GDP at 3.8 trillion compared with India's 3.6 trillion. With a GDP of nearly 18 trillion, China exceeds both the ASEAN group and India by a factor of almost 5. At the individual level, Indonesia's economy is the only economy that surpasses the $1 trillion mark with a GDP of 1.4 trillion, accounting for 36% of total ASEAN GDP. In the middle of the pack, Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia come in around the $500 billion mark. Despite its oil wealth, Brunei, with its very small population of 500,000 people, finds itself at the bottom of the GDP scale, accompanied by the lower developmental group countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. The GDP growth rate of ASEAN slightly exceeds India, with both having a GDP growth rate almost 6 times lower than China. If we examine the GDP growth rate relative to the 2023 GDP, we find an average relative GDP growth rate of 4%, plus or minus 0.8%. The countries falling outside of the one standard deviation band include Brunei. Plagued by the sluggish growth rates that often characterize petrostates, Brunei has the lowest relative GDP growth rate in the group. Laos and Myanmar, due to their comparatively low economic starting points, have growth rates of 5.6 and 5.2% respectively. Manufacturing is critical for economic development, especially for developing countries with large populations. Here we examine to what degree manufacturing value-added MVA contributed to GDP growth from 2005 to 2023. Most countries are in between 15 and 25%, indicating that manufacturing is a significant contributor to GDP growth. China and Vietnam, highly reliant on manufacturing, come in at 26%, whereas India sits at only 13%. India's greater reliance on its high-skilled service sector, especially in tech, at the expense of its manufacturing sector, one that could employ more of its vast population, is a potential impediment to India's future MVA and GDP growth. At the bloc level, the 2023 MVA of ASEAN was almost 1.7 times greater than India, despite the total population of ASEAN being half that of India. China's MVA was almost 4 times higher than the combined MVA of both India and ASEAN. Within the ASEAN bloc, Indonesia accounts for 33% of MVA, with Thailand and Vietnam accounting for another 30%. Singapore, despite its small population size, accounting for only 1% of total ASEAN population, overperforms with its high-tech, high-value-added manufacturing sector, contributing an outsized 12% to the bloc's overall MVA. The absolute MVA growth rate of China is roughly 10 times greater than that of India and ASEAN. If we examine the MVA growth rate relative to the 2023 MVA, we find an average relative MVA growth rate of 4%, plus or minus 1.5%. Due to its low developmental starting point, Myanmar has experienced the highest relative MVA growth from 2005 to 2023. At slightly above 5.2%, Vietnam manages to just surpass China's relative MVA growth rate of 4.9%. Beginning around a decade ago, global MVA growth experienced a slowdown. After 15 years of extreme growth in China's manufacturing sector, it seems global manufacturing may be approaching a saturation point. If we examine global MVA from 2004 to 2021 and split this time frame into two parts, we can notice that global MVA growth was only 66% as high when compared with the first period. We'll perform a similar analysis for ASEAN, India, and China. This will give us insight into which countries have maintained or increased manufacturing growth despite the global slowdown. Period A we'll define as the period from 2005 until 2015, and for period B, we'll use 2016 to 2023. We then perform a linear regression for these two periods in order to calculate M, the growth rate or slope of the MVA time series. We then calculate an MVA growth ratio, M2 over M1. Here we can see that the Philippines, with an M2 over M1 ratio of only 0.3, has faced a significant contraction in its MVA growth rate since 2016, with MVA growth dropping by around 70%. As the ASEAN bloc is highly integrated with China, the frequent geopolitical tensions between China and the Philippines may play a partial role in explaining a decrease in manufacturing growth in the Philippines. The winner in the ASEAN bloc are Vietnam and Singapore, their MVA growth ratios being greater than 1 at 1.6 and 2.2 respectively. Vietnam has benefited tremendously from the U.S.-China trade and tariff war that began in 2018. These factors, in addition to Vietnam's labor costs, much lower than China's, have resulted in significant job creation and an increase in foreign direct investment. Singapore's highly advanced manufacturing sector, by focusing on high value-added, high-tech products like biotech and semiconductor manufacturing, has led to exceptional growth in MVA. Here, we present the manufacturing growth ratio for all countries. We find that the majority of countries have an MVA growth ratio less than 1, suggesting a slowdown in MVA growth. China is at 0.9, India and Indonesia are at 0.7, and the ASEAN bloc is at 0.8. As a main driver of GDP growth, countries that fail to boost growth in their manufacturing sectors may face economic headwinds in the future. Finally, we'll examine foreign direct investment, or FDI, for the ASEAN bloc, India, and China. We can see that the cumulative FDI from 2000 to 2023 received by India is the lowest of the group, around 3.5 times lower than ASEAN and almost 6 times lower than China. If we examine the individual countries, we see that Singapore has received the bulk of foreign direct investment in the region, accounting for 57% of all ASEAN FDI. Singapore exists not only as a center of high-tech manufacturing, but it also serves as the financial hub of the region. It also has very advantageous tax policies. Often considered a tax haven, Singapore draws much foreign money for the purpose of tax planning, rather than for more materially productive purposes. If we plot cumulative FDI versus GDP, we can calculate a capital conversion factor that provides insight into how much FDI converts to or correlates to GDP growth. There are many different forms of foreign direct investment. Some are more productive than others. Investments that are targeted towards building factories, purchasing high-tech capital equipment, or improving infrastructure may be expected to improve downstream GDP growth, whereas foreign capital flows that merely seek to shelter money from taxation will be less productive. The slope value, GDP over cumulative FDI, allows us to assess the correlation between FDI and GDP growth. For Singapore, we find a capital conversion factor of 0.3, where $1 in cumulative FDI correlated to only a 30-cent increase in GDP. At the high end of the scale, we find China, India, and Indonesia, where $1 of cumulative FDI correlated to a $3 or $4 increase in GDP. If we plot cumulative FDI as a percentage of 2023 GDP, we arrive at this graph. Singapore is a strong outlier at 296%. Laos and Cambodia are also on the high end with 90 and 130% respectively. However, Laos and Cambodia are very low on the developmental scale, so a high FDI relative to GDP could merely be viewed as a sign that investment and development has come to these countries. If we compare Singapore with the countries of the European Union, we can find that the countries that are generally considered tax havens, Ireland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Cyprus, and Malta, also have a higher cumulative FDI relative to GDP. Singapore's world-class banking system, along with its favorable tax policies, result in a lot of foreign capital taking up residence in its country's banks. Singapore's business-friendly environment, the strength and reliability of its banking sector, and its stable political environment make it a magnet for foreign cash within the region. In the second quarter of the 21st century, the economic energy and activity will most likely continue shifting to Asia. The neoliberal order that has reigned since the fall of the Soviet Union, one characterized by influence and dominance from the US and the European Union, will likely fragment into a more balanced distribution of power centers. This change, especially post-pandemic and after the start of the Ukraine war, shows up in the flows of foreign capital. Since 2021, the European Union has seen massive capital outflows as the old money begins to flee the old continent. Between 2000 and 2021, the EU received an average of $557 billion in net inflows of FDI. Since then, this positive inflow of cash has quickly turned negative, with 2023 seeing negative $300 billion in net FDI leave the European Union, a drop of $860 billion from the previous average. China has also seen a dramatic drop. Net inflow of FDI into China dropped to only $42 billion, down significantly from the typical FDI inflows of $200 to $300 billion per year. FDI to ASEAN, however, shows no sign of slowing down. All of this is potentially very good news for the countries of ASEAN. With foreign capital looking for more promising markets, the countries of Southeast Asia, as well as India, may have a promising future with an accelerated growth outlook. But what these countries ultimately have are their exceptional demographics. The countries that dominated the first quarter of the 21st century have rapidly aging populations. China, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union all have a median age over 40. With the exception of Singapore, the population of the ASEAN nations are much younger, with a median age of around 30 years old, similar to India. All of these factors, the new emerging geopolitical order, demographics, the burgeoning US-China trade wars, and foreign cash looking for promising new markets, all stack the deck in favor of Southeast Asia and the nations of ASEAN. If you made it this far, thank you for your time, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like. And if you have any comments or suggestions for future videos, please write to me in the comments. Thanks to Aditya for suggesting the topic for this video, and regardless of what continent you live on, have a nice day or night.